let's start with the positives. Who would like to start? And you might talk about the framework, about your own experiences, either being inspected or as inspectors, however you wish to interpret it. What's good about Ofsted currently?
It's the currently that I'm struggling a bit with.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello once again, my fathomless friends, and welcome to another episode of the Rethinking Education podcast, Education's critical friend. My name is James Mannion, and I am delighted to welcome you to this episode, which features a really interesting conversation with two former HMIs, Frank Norris and Julie Grimshaw. Before I introduce Frank and Julie, a quick word, if I may, about the Rethinking Education Conference, which is back later this year on Saturday the 23rd of September at Parliament Hill School in North London. It's an amazing conference. It's a conference like no other that brings together people from all different walks of life, mainstream educators, alternative educators, children and young people, parents and carers, unschoolers, homeschoolers, you name it, everybody all under one roof, and not just in the audience but equally represented on the platforms as far as possible. Tickets are selling like hotcakes, so get in there quickly if you want one, and we're running a special offer for friends of the Rethinking Education podcast. If you type in the promo code RE20FRIEND, that's all uppercase, RE20FRIEND, you'll get a 20% discount on the ticket price. And there are also free tickets available for people who need them. There are reduced price tickets for people who need those. And there are full price tickets available for those who can afford them. So get yourself a ticket, and there are still 5 days, I believe, 4 days left until the speaker application deadline is expiring. So if you'd like to do a talk on something or take part in a debate or a panel or something like that, get yourself over to the Rethinking Education website and fill out the application form. This podcast is brought to you by you, or if not you, by other listeners and viewers. This is a listener and viewer funded operation. If you would like to contribute to this operation so that I can spend more time doing things like this, then please feel free to visit patreon.com/repod, that's REPOD. That's if you want to make a monthly subscription, or you can just pay per episode if you like. And if you'd rather just do a one-off donation, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/repod. I don't actually drink coffee. Caffeine makes me go even more weird, but you can buy me a herbal tea if you so wish. If you can't afford to do either of those things, the content will always remain free. Please feel free to spread the word, spread the love on social media, or give us a thumbs up or a positive rating on a platform of your choosing. Okay, and so to today's guests. Frank Norris is a former head teacher and HMI, that stands for His Majesty's Inspector, with decades of experience inspecting and leading schools. He was initially seconded to Ofsted in 1995 for a year when he was mentored by Miriam Rosen, who would later become the Chief Inspector of Schools at Ofsted. In 2001, Frank became an HMI and led inspections in a wide range of schools and settings, including secure units, independent schools, prisons, initial teacher education, as well as in primary and secondary schools in England and overseas. From 2014 to 2019, Frank was the CEO of the Coop Academies Trust, a very highly regarded and one of the highest performing trusts for disadvantaged students, according to reports by the DFE, the Education Policy Institute, and the Sutton Trust. In 2019, Frank was awarded an MBE for services to education, and he is also the co-host of the excellent Frankenstein podcast. Julie Grimshaw is also a former HMI with a successful track record in supporting school improvement, especially around teaching and learning. She's a school improvement advisor who has previously been an inspector of schools and of ITE, Initial Teacher Education. She was a PGCE course leader at Manchester Metropolitan University and an advisor to the Teacher Development Agency and to the Department for Education. She's also been an external moderator for Initial Teacher Education and a teacher of music and English. 2 years ago, Julie started blogging about Ofsted, and her website, julesmusings.blog, Jules musings.blog, is well worth a visit. I'll just share the opening paragraph, if I may, of her most recent blog, which sets the scene for this conversation that you're about to hear quite nicely. The blog is called "This Time It's Personal," and it reads, "I started to blog about my views on Ofsted in October 2021. At the time, many school leaders contacted me privately to say that they were deeply concerned about the negative impact of inspections. However, all were fearful in expressing those views publicly. Since the story of Ruth Perry's tragic death hit the news in March 2023, it feels as if the floodgates have opened. For the first time, many school leaders, staff and parents are sharing their own personal experiences, and it's fair to say that overall, it's not pretty." Close quote. In short, when it comes to Ofsted, Frank and Julie know their onions, and the powers that be, and indeed everybody else, should listen very carefully to what they have to say. So, without further ado, I will now hand over to my recent fascinating conversation with Frank Norris and Julie Price Grimshaw. I hope you enjoy the show.
Frank Norris and Julie Grimshaw, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us. I feel rather privileged to be here because I do watch these. I'm a follower of your podcast, so it's great to be invited.
Oh, thank you. That's nice to hear. And also, it's a return fixture, isn't it? Because I came on your podcast with Andy Hodgkinson a while ago. So It's nice to return the favour. And hi, Julie.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Really, really pleased to be with you.
So thank you both for taking the time to join me. And in this short series, we'll see how long this series lasts. We've had about 8 people who've agreed to speak so far, either head teachers or former head teachers, or in some cases former inspectors, which I think is the case in your case, Frank. Have you been an inspector as well, Julie?
Yes. Yeah.
You have. Right, there you go. And we're also going to get some young people on. So already this thing is growing legs and taking on a different form. A group of young people, are you familiar with the States of Mind project? A group of young people who did a really interesting inquiry over about 2 or 3 years, where they looked at Ofsted and accountability and inspection more widely, and they came up with their proposal for how we might have a more intelligent accountability system. And there's a documentary about it called The Framework. You're nodding there, Frank. Did you see that?
Yeah, I watched it. It's interesting because a lot of the stuff that they were suggesting, I think Julie and I would agree with some of it. There is definitely a sort of a different feel or a different viewpoint is probably the way to describe it when you're, say, a head teacher, or you're, say, the government, for example, wanting to have sight of what's happening in schools. Some of I remember 1 or 2 of the suggestions probably wouldn't land that well, but the majority of them did, with me anyway.
Yeah, well, I think that this is why we, this work that I've been doing recently around implementation science and this idea of vertical slice teams, nobody's got all the answers. Young people have got some really valuable, important stuff to say, but obviously they don't have the experience of a government minister or a head teacher or an executive head, say. And likewise, we often forget what it was like to be a young person, or what it was like to be a classroom teacher or a parent. And that's why we need everybody to be sitting around the decision-making table, looking at this thing in the round. And so anyway, let's get into all that. So first of all, would you just like to introduce yourselves? Let's go Frank and then Julie, about the work that you've done and what you do currently.
Okay. Well, I was a primary head teacher. I had 2 headships. The second one, we were one of the first schools to be inspected in the mid-90s. And Ofsted were then charged with trying to complete all the school inspections, because this was a new sort of arrangement to inspect all schools, and they were running out of time, so they seconded head teachers. So I became a head teacher inspector for the year in 1995-96, and after that, which I really enjoyed. It sharpened me up really in terms of thinking about a more broader view about what achievement was. That's probably the best word, rather than attainment, but achievement. So I went back to headship and did that for 4-5 years, and then I became an HMI, and for Ofsted. And HMI are the sort of like full-time staff of Ofsted, and I have to say that was sort of one of the proudest moments of my career. It was in those days a Privy Council appointment, and I remember telling my father-in-law, who unfortunately died shortly after, but he was a real monarchist. He just thought this was unbelievable. He just thought that his daughter had married somebody who'd been appointed by the Privy Council. He just couldn't get over it. I remember the dinner we had in the meal we had at home. It was just like a fantastic event, and I felt incredibly proud. And actually, when I became an HMI, I was one of the few people that had actually inspected. So a lot of the inspectors who were doing school or were involved, HMI involved in inspection, some of them didn't do many inspections. Some did quite a bit, but some didn't. So I joined a team that was involved in school inspections, quality assuring it and developing frameworks, and really that's where my career in Ofsted ran. So I became involved in quality assuring and in drafting, coming up with ideas on how frameworks would be introduced and what would go into them. So so that was really the basis of my HMI career, and I left in 2012, and then various things, became the CEO of a Coop Academies Trust, which is now quite a large trust. And then in 2019, I left. I became a certain age and thought it was the right time to leave. So I've been doing sort of advisory work ever since, really.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And before we come on to you, Julie, can you just please clarify? I've never really been clear about this. What's the difference between an HMI and an Ofsted inspector? I used to think that they were one and the same thing, but that's not the case, is it?
Do you want to do that, Julie?
Well, as you said, the HMI are the permanent, they civil service members, really. That is the only job they do. It's pretty rare for HMI to be doing anything else other than being HMI. Whereas Ofsted inspectors, I mean, at the moment, you'll find a lot of Ofsted inspectors that are current head teachers, or, people with senior positions in multi-academy trusts, and they will do that, and then they'll do so many inspections a year. But HMI are the permanent staff at the Office of Standards for Education.
Can I say something, James? Because I've been thinking about a couple of the points I wanted to get across in the chat. Because when you stop being an HMI, I stopped inspecting in 2012, and then became sort of, I saw the reality of the inspection process from the other side, and I felt as though when I joined, I don't know what year did you join, Julie? What year did you become an HMI?
2001.
Yeah, so that's the same time as me, and when I joined that group of HMI, there were a number of people who had spent 20 years as HMI. They had seen an awful lot of change, from a period where the Ofsted didn't exist even, into a point where it had morphed into this sort of inspection machine. And actually, I think there were a really mixed bunch. There were people, I remember one colleague who had taught for a long period of time in East Africa and had been a head teacher. And I was just sort of, in a way, in awe of some of their insight that they were bringing, and one of the most enjoyable periods was when, as a new HMI, you'd spend an hour a week in Ofsted's head office, and you'll be sitting with an HMI clearing reports, reading reports, and just chatting to that senior colleague. And that was a whole week of induction, really, into not just about reports, but it was about the history of HMI, work that he or she had done, you know, some of the challenges that you faced, you know, what good education felt like, you know, the sorts of stuff that, you know, it was. And my whole first year was like Julie's, was a whole year of induction, and all of that washed over me, you know, as well as the amount of inspections I'd done before I joined. But it was the highest quality experience I could ever have had, and included inspecting a service school in Germany, you know, prison inspections. I remember visiting one of an independent school where parents were paying fortune for their kids to be taught at that school. You know, now the experience of an HMI is very, very different to the experience that Julie and I had. And as I reflect on this in my career, I think, wow, we really have diminished the importance of HMI, because I can reflect on the differences I've had joining and what they get now. And it's not now investment in the HMI. It's about get them in, get them inspecting, and let's see how many of them can survive, and perhaps we can use them as they move along. But HMI, you know, are now promoted very, very quickly and very early. And that means that I think diminishes the quality of the work that they do over time.
Right. Interesting. Thank you for that.
I just wanted to get that off my chest.
Yeah, well, we'll maybe come back around to that later on, because it's really interesting to have that insider's perspective. So Julie, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Yeah, I taught mostly music in secondary, and although I did some cross-phase work at the time, so I was doing some music in primary as well. I was always quite interested in training teachers, so I was interested in mentoring and so on. After I was working in schools, I got a chance to go and run a PGCE at Manchester Met University. So I ran the music PGCE there, and I also worked on the primary BEd course there. So I was doing primary and secondary, which was fantastic because I really like doing cross-phase work. Now, just before I left school to join Manchester Met University, we had what was then called a Section 10 inspection. And one of these legendary inspections that you may have heard of, where you had these people in for a week and you had lay inspectors that sort of did strange things like go and knock on the door of parents across the road and say, what do you think of that place? And it was all quite bizarre. But, you went through it for a week. You got 2 terms notice. The reason I knew we were having an inspection was 2 terms before I got handed a paint chart and asked to choose the colour of paint I would like for the music rooms. And I said, Ofsted are coming, aren't they? And they said, yeah. Got the brown envelope. We've got the brown envelope, So we went through this inspection, and it was very, very stressful building up to it. The week itself, to be honest, wasn't as bad as the build up. The inspection I went through was okay. And the music inspector, the people that were inspecting the subjects knew their
stuff, didn't they?
That was the thing. The guy that inspected me, he was very, very good. Yeah,
these were national figures, many of them. These were people that you'd heard about. I'd heard about them before I joined, and then you have the conversation with them, you realize they're ordinary people, but actually they're people that were highly regarded in their area.
Yeah, they knew the stuff, and they
knew the stuff.
So that was actually my experience of Ofsted at that point was pretty good. And then I went to run this course at MMU, and I was inspected. Then my 1-year PGCE was inspected. And if you thought having inspectors around for a week was bad, in those days in initial teacher training, they were in for a year, not constantly, but they were constantly coming back, going away, coming back, going away. They sat in the sessions, they looked at your curriculum, they spoke to the trainees, they went out to see the trainees teach, they looked at everything, and it took a full year. And by the end of that year, they knew your course very well. Now, I was inspected by I knew this lady as one of the top figures in music education in the country. And she was pretty modest, and she was always referring to people who worked in teacher training as the experts in music education. But the brilliant thing was, every time she came in, we'd sit down and she'd say, hey, have you heard about what such and such a body's doing with steel pans? You really need to get and see this because I think it's going to be brilliant for your trainees. So everything we did was about supporting, improving, being really innovative. And sometimes she'd say, hey, have you tried this vocal workshop stuff that, you know, and I'd say, yeah, we did that. And, you know, it worked. It was amazing in some schools, not so good in others. And, oh, well, that's, you know, 'twas ever thus. We'd spend hours talking about education. We'd just spend hours, and she'd say, I'll tell you, I've been to some providers this week. This is what they were doing. I think you should give this a go. And that was the nature of the discussion. I thought it was fantastic. It was inspection. So there was always that, you know, you never lost sight that this is an HMI. And you know, she's there to inspect me. But actually, it was the best professional development I ever had. She was just brilliant. Now, that job I had at MMU, which was a wonderful job, was a fixed term contract. They couldn't guarantee it would be permanent. They thought it might, but they couldn't guarantee it. And so I sort of start looking around. She phoned me one day. She said, I'm just giving you the heads up. There's going to be an advert for HMI. It's a niche thing. It's music, initial teacher training. And I think you should apply. And I did. And I joined Ofsted as an inspector of initial teacher training as a music specialist.
Right. And this is in 2001.
That was in 2001, and I had a year's induction during which I worked with probably some of the sharpest people I've ever met. They were amazing. And yeah, I went to inspect a school in Mönchengladbach, and I did quite a lot in primary. I made it my business to learn about early years, and you know, I've never lost that interest in early years as a result. And yeah, we had an amazing year's induction. Now, I don't know if this was the case with you, Frank, but we generally did not lead an inspection at all during the first year. It was considered, you know, something that you did once you'd had that experience.
Yeah, so, even though I actually had done a lot more school inspection than my mentor. But even so, I was not allowed to do lead an inspection until there was a problem. There was a problem on a primary inspection where I don't know, there'd been a complaint, and so it had to be re-inspected. So I was then suddenly made to sort of re-inspect a school that had recently been inspected, and that was the first time I was allowed to inspect, even though I'd probably led about 50 school inspections before that. But it was like, that was the way that you were inducted. It wasn't as much about process. It was more about, I think we underestimate the intellectual element of leading inspections. You know, it's all become, in those days there was very little guidance. It was all very much, here's the process. You know, there were no grade descriptors, and actually there were a lot of judgments being made, and you had to sort of weave a story with these judgments. And actually some colleagues found that, you know, pretty tough. You know, it wasn't just the telling of the, you know, making the judgments. It was, how does that judgment connect with another judgment we've made in another area? Aren't they, you know, and actually seeing these potential conflicts emerging within the inspection, which actually would then unravel when you try to write up the report and they're read by your mentor. You know, that was just a pretty, it was a really rigorous, very, very quite academic process. And it was challenging. It was challenging.
It was also the fact that, sorry, I was just following on from that in the teacher training inspections that, as I say, lasted a year, everything was moderated. And we went to the Holiday Inn in Leicester in the middle of a roundabout. We weren't allowed out of the place. And everybody sat around in big teams saying, right, you've said this is good. Yes. You've said this is good. Let's compare your good to that good. And we spent days doing this, and then final moderation. And I remember that, you know, my colleagues saying to me, we're never going to send out a report that isn't right. And we all agree it's right. And we know that something that's outstanding there compares with something that's outstanding. It might not be identical, but we've got to get it right. And there was this, I mean, when you think about it, it must have been the most horrendously expensive process. Yes. But I'm pretty confident it was right. You know, there was just too many people involved to get it wrong, really. And grades got changed, and there was there were arguments, to be honest, but it was very thorough.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good model of practice. So there's these three questions.
James, we could witter on about this experience, for another 2 hours.
Well, that's why we're here. Let's see how long we go for. So I often ask people the same three questions in this podcast. What are the positives about education broadly, or about some particular topic? What are the major challenges that we face? And what might be the solutions? How might we fix or overcome these challenges that we face currently? And I think it might be a good idea to use those three questions as a sort of as a general structure to the rest of this conversation. But before we start on the positives, you've just been talking about the history of it. I just wonder. So Ofsted came into being in 1992, didn't it? So it's just over 30 years old. And so I think Major was in power in 92, but I guess it was a Thatcher idea because it would have taken a while to come to fruition. But I was just wondering, because you were a head teacher then, Frank, weren't you? I don't know if you were as well, Julie. But what was happening before then? Why did Ofsted come into being, and what problem was it addressing?
Right. Well, this goes back to my first year as a teacher in 1979. And at a school very close to us here, where my children went to school and my grandchildren are going to this school, and there was a bookshelf in there, and there were these little booklets which were about technology in primary schools or science in secondary schools, and they all had a little red binder, a little side of them. They're all coloured sort of red or pink or something, and all laid up. They made this sort of ripple effect. So these were called the Raspberry Ripple reports. And I remember reading one of those and thinking, who the hell produced these? This is really interesting, and it was at a time when it was very difficult to get a sense of how much science is being taught, because you would get these HMI reports, but they were not really, they were about visits to quite a small number of schools. Not every school was being inspected. So I remember at the time thinking, this looks really interesting, this stuff. This is really sort of hardcore stuff, really. This is different to what we were getting. But at that time, somebody said it would take you about 150 years before you'd meet an HMI. The chances of your school being inspected were that high. And so in a way, everybody was very relaxed about it. If you got an HMI inspection, then nobody knew what they were going to be like. And actually, I only later found out, Julie, that there wasn't really any framework. It was really just, a group of HMI would descend on a school and they'd try and work out, they'd all visit, they'd all have their own sort of agendas, a bit of bias here. And then these team meetings must have been a real humdinger of a team meeting. Somebody tried to pull all of these things together.
I see. So something similar was happening in the 70s. It was just like much less structured and much more infrequent. It's more like sampling rather than checking on every school.
HMI was still viewed as advisors as well. There is always this debate about the swinging from advising into inspection, and where we're at the moment, I think we're swinging back from hardcore inspection. You can feel we've reached that, and we're now coming back. And the interesting point is, how far will this sort of pendulum swing? Will it continue to be about inspection, or will it actually move more into advising? And it feels as though it could settle. I hope it settles in a more sort of less contentious place, where there's a place for HMI, really high quality inspectors, to convey to a school, well, actually, I've seen some fantastic practice down the road. You really ought to go and see it. I think it'd make a difference. We still need to have some form of inspection. I still think there's something in there. So going back to the question, before Ofsted, there was some inspection, but very, very thin. Sort of the amounts of it were very small, and it was all very much, I'm not saying made up as you go along, but it wasn't as clearly defined as it is today.
I see. Okay, right. And so I guess that the problems that they were trying to address were A, that it was sort of not that structured, and B, and therefore probably not that consistent, and B, that there may have been schools that were sort of slipping through the cracks, say, where there were schools that were not being held to account enough, I guess.
William Tyndall. Do you remember William Tyndall?
The infamous
primary
school in the 70s.
That became, I remember, a panorama program, or one of those programs, fly on the wall things, that caused quite a stir.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the beginnings of, this sort of thought that there. I'm not suggesting that was going on everywhere, but there were certainly. I trained as a teacher in London in the 70s. On one of the practices I had in the staff room, there was a timetable, and I was told to put my name on the bottom of that timetable. It was a list of teachers, and that meant I could have it was a calendar. That Friday I could take off, because everybody took a Friday off every now and again.
Right.
That was me training in the mid 70s as a teacher. Sounds
I think
good.
when
we talk about things that are better, I think the professionalism of teaching and teachers, the whole thing's become much more professional, and there's been a much greater focus on giving the young people a really good chance, and trying not to allow children to fail, to give them a quality experience. I think we were trying to do that, but I don't think it was done in the same sort of determined way by everybody, in quite the same way that it is today.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because we sort of, we talk a lot about problems in education, don't we? And how, like endless policy churn and so on. But I don't think anyone could deny that things are better now than they were. Like, I was at school in the 80s and early 90s. And I remember, my PE teacher just used to sit and smoke cigarettes, just chain smoke cigarettes while we played football, or while we did cross-country running or whatever. And lots of weird stuff like that happening. And without a doubt, teaching has become much more professionalized, and the quality of what happens in schools has improved, I think, through that period. And maybe Ofsted has had a hand in that. And so which leads us neatly actually into this first of our three questions about the positives. First of all, you might interpret this question in any way that you wish to, but just before we sort of get into the challenges, and obviously Ofsted has been in the news a lot recently. It's a very heated debate unfolding at the moment, currently quite a one-sided debate, with Ofsted themselves and the DfE not having said much yet. But I think that they're waiting for various things to happen before they make. I don't think that they've got a plan. I don't think that they saw this coming, and I don't think that they've got really a plan for how to reform. And these things take time, so it's sort of not surprising. But we're at a really interesting point, aren't we, in this trajectory, and it doesn't look like this story is going away anytime soon. So we'll see where it goes. So anyway, before we get into all of that, let's start with the positives. Who would like to start? And you might talk about the framework, about your own experiences, either being inspected or as inspectors, however you wish to interpret it. What's good about Ofsted currently?
It's the currently that I'm struggling a bit with.
Okay, all right. So maybe all right. Then let's take the word currently off. Like, out of your, I mean, you've already talked about some examples of this, Julie. Some of these really rigorous, incredibly robust induction process, this incredibly robust moderation process. So I guess the good could be like in Ofsted's not too distant history, there has been, really excellent practice, which perhaps we might get back to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that something that you'd be happy with?
Yeah, I think the chance to disseminate really good practice. I don't believe anything. I don't believe in silver bullets, magic formulas, but when you've been around so many hundreds of schools, people just have the benefit of that experience. I work as an advisor at the moment. It's just that I go around lots of schools. So the potential for people to support, to disseminate great ideas, to encourage innovation, and also I'm always wanting, when I speak to people in schools, why are we here anyway? And they'll always say, oh, we're here for the children. Yeah, but we want more than that. If we're saying we're here to promote these sort of basic skills, and skills is not, skills isn't a fashionable word at the moment, but if we've got that, yes, okay. But actually, I think we're there to promote lifelong learning. We're there to instill a lifelong appetite for learning that's going to stay with the people, the young people that we teach. I think that's what it's about. And I think that in inspection, the potential is there, whatever form inspection takes, we've all got ideas. That's the potential, because we've seen it happen, because that's what it used to be like. And actually, in my experience, heads are hungry for that. They welcome that. They're looking for solutions. They're looking for great ideas. They're looking for innovation. They're looking for what works for their communities and their pupils.
Yeah, I think they're looking for that encouragement, aren't they, as well? I mean, a colleague of mine, well, you both know Stan Johnson, and Stan often says the story about, well, he often hears head teachers say, well, we've got this great project we're thinking of doing, but we'll wait until we've had our Ofsted before we start it.
Yeah.
And actually, I think that I'm sort of optimistic, because actually, when I think about what schools have had to face over the last few years, and when I visit them, they're still optimistic places. They're still full of very optimistic young people. They're still full of very optimistic teachers, who are battling hard to try and offer the best. And we know that there are bits that we will talk about today that are stopping them from giving their best at times. But actually, still, it's that sense of optimism that is still out there, that I think is quite remarkable, really, that they're still doing that. And when I, like Julie, when I visit schools, I don't come away from the schools, and some of the schools I visit are in some of the most challenging areas of the north. I generally come out thinking, wow, that's really good, and I think there's something here about the media coverage of some of the most challenging areas and the schools in those communities. Actually, you need to get in there, folks, and see it. Don't believe the horror stories that you're hearing about, which some people want to promote, about behavior and all this stuff. Yeah, attendance is low in some schools because actually, as a country, we haven't invested enough in the young people as we came out of COVID. And actually some of them got out of the habit of going to school, but we needed to make sure that there was something there in the offer that was a bit different to what they had before, that probably would have brought them back in. We simply have not invested enough in them. But having said all of that, you go into those schools, kids are kids, and they're just great. They just want to share their excitement. And you feel as though, just give these kids a chance, because actually, if the whole country was as optimistic as a year 9 or a year 10 kid was, we'd be in a much better place, So don't believe everything you read in the press about how bad it is, and about fights here and fights there. That is not my experience. It goes on. It went on in my day. It probably went on in our days in schools. But actually, these are not schools out of control. Get rid of that. That's not what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I agree. I've worked in one school that was in special measures, and I've also worked in outstanding and good schools, and there's very little difference. There's so much good stuff happening in a so-called special measures school on the naughty step, and there's so much dodgy stuff happening in outstanding schools. The overlap is just far greater than anybody would realize. So absolutely, it's a really difficult job teaching, and kids are challenging as well as sort of exhilarating and amazing people to be around. But yeah, totally agree. And the thing that you said about people often saying, oh, I've got this brilliant idea for a school improvement initiative, but we're in an Ofsted window, and so we're going to not do this innovative stuff that we think the kids really need or will benefit from. You hear that all the time. And that's maybe a common theme that will emerge from these conversations, that there's this, it's the way in which Ofsted sort of thwarts innovation and stops leaders from doing what they think is right for the kids in front of them. That's definitely something that you hear a lot of. So is there anything else that you would add to the positives column before we move into challenges?
I think leadership is more mature. I mean, it's aware, and the challenges are greater. We were saying before about my experience in 1980, it was quite regular we had a pub at the end of the road. It's not there anymore, but Friday lunchtime, somebody said, do you fancy going for a pint? So we'd go down to the pub. Nowadays, rightly, leaders would have a view that that's unprofessional conduct, and all of this, But I think that leadership is more aware of itself and the processes that can lead to effective leadership. The challenges are greater though. So that's, I think, the reasons why, some leaders are bailing out, are finding it too tough, because actually leaders years ago didn't have quite the same accountability measures that they've got in place today. But I think leadership, I'm impressed by, the numbers are not high. The numbers wanting to be senior leaders are not high. They're not as high as they used to be. But actually those that want it, they're hungry for it, and I'm impressed by the quality of their insight and also their ambition.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo all of that. And so, but it's interesting to note, like, so Julie, you sort of said that it was the word currently that you were struggling with a bit. And Frank, in your answers, you were sort of saying like young people are really optimistic. The schools that you go into, they're not as bad as people sometimes make them out to be. Leadership, you see lots of positives there, but you also haven't really pointed to that many positives in terms of like the current state of Ofsted. And yet you were both talking about something that you were a part of in the 90s and early 2000s that was something that you were proud to be a part of. So let's move into the challenges then. What has happened? What do you see happening currently that you don't like the look of? What is Ofsted not doing that it should be doing? What is it doing that it shouldn't be doing? Who would like to pick that up first?
Go on, Julie, you go first. I feel as I've spoken too much already. So
no, it's all right. Yeah, actually, it's hard to know where to start with this one. I think we can say from what we know about what's in the media at the moment, I'm going to say I don't know of a time when the relationship between Ofsted and schools has been as bad as it is now. And before we even talk about why and what that means and so on, we have to see that this is a very, very bad basis to be going in and making judgments about schools. So if we had to sort of separate some of the things, inspections are very high stakes. And, spoke to a radio presenter not long ago, and he said, people keep saying this and I don't know what it means. What does it mean, high stakes? Well, if your school gets 2 RI judgments or it gets an inadequate judgment, it's probably going to be under new management. You might lose your job. It's that serious. Other people might lose the job. Other people will leave. You'll face problems recruiting staff. Parents will take their kids away. And he said, wow, that is high stakes. I didn't realize it was like that, So it's the way it's become more high stakes, I think. The stress that comes from Ofsted, the stories that are coming forward now are scary. I wrote a couple of blogs in 2021. Frank and I talked a lot about them. I got people writing to me confidentially saying, I agree with everything you're saying, but I can never go public on this. I can never speak up. I'm too scared. Ofsted are coming back. They'll take it out on me. Or my governors have said I must never tell anybody about the terrible Ofsted we had and the damage it did. I must never tell anybody. My MAT people, Multi-Academy Trust people have told me they're not happy, but we've just got to pretend it's okay because Ofsted will come back and they will take it out on us. And I was thinking, wow, this is really unhealthy. People can't speak out because they use this phrase, Ofsted will come, they'll take it out on us. So that doesn't really smack of fairness anyway, does it? So we've now got this thing that's morphed into some sort of monster. Part of it, Frank said something on Twitter today that really struck a chord with me, and that was if only Ofsted when Ofsted resumed inspections after COVID, which was autumn term 21, if only they'd reported on what they were seeing rather than what they wanted to see. Because what we've got now is a lot of problems that have got much worse because Ofsted wanted to pretend it had never happened. I think one of the things that disturbs me most about Ofsted at the moment, I don't know if you're aware, James, of the crib sheets that were leaked last year.
Oh, yeah.
The crib sheets that were there to assist inspectors in asking the right questions. Some of them are just really, really worrying because what we were talking about with children being optimistic, lifelong learners, enthusiastic, creative, inquisitive. If you look at the early years crib sheet, you will see that there are things in there that are set to destroy any part of that. And we don't know where this has come from. I mean, there are people that, you know, are absolute gurus in early years, and I'm looking at this stuff saying, what? Well, you know, and they're saying the same. You know, it's actually very poor advice.
Could you give an example? Is there anything that springs to mind as like an explicit instance of something that was in that early years crib sheet?
Yeah, so there's one thing that's being discussed a lot at the moment, and it's about the Ofsted recommendation on the crib sheet for early writing. So there's this notion that, you know, for instance, a child shouldn't be writing their name until they've learned the, you know, phonics part of that. But actually, we do get a lot of children coming to early years who can already write their own name, and they don't have to know that, you know, this letter sounds like this. They just know their name. So it's hugely restrictive, and it says it's got to be engineered for success, and it's got to be planned. And 4-year-olds should be subject to dictation activities, and we're thinking, no, let's just have them. I actually cited a thing from inspection where a little boy, you know, made some marks on a piece of paper, and he says, "This is real writing," he said to me. I said, "Is it? That's fantastic." He said, "It's a story and I'm going to read it to you." And he read it to me and two of his friends, and he stood and read it. And it was a story about a green dinosaur, just absolutely magical. So that's not happening, according to Ofsted. That shouldn't be happening, because you should be only teaching the sounds in the order that they appear in your approved scheme. They shouldn't be writing their names on cards. They shouldn't be doing anything they're not familiar with. And it's all from the teacher. It's not from children watching each other learning. And early years is magical for that. So why are they telling inspectors to do that? Why are they saying things like, you know, there's a video where it says you've got to teach a little toddler how to use a shape sorter? No, because that's the whole point of it, is that they're going to learn.
I saw that this idea that knowledge has to precede skill, and like you say, that even the word skill is sort of, you know, like the new like sort of, what's the word, like nemesis. It's also not even considered to exist. It's just practiced knowledge. This idea that you need the knowledge. Have you ever, like, I saw somebody put a tweet about that yesterday. Like, have you ever seen a kid with a shape sorter? They're just like mashing the square one into the circle one, and then that doesn't work. Like, they don't need prior knowledge. Like you say, that's literally how those things work. Is that you just like try them, and then, you know, you learn experientially, and then you're like, oh right, that one goes in there, and it's satisfying when it does, and you can see the learning happening, you know. They do seem to be struggling. I agree, with early years in particular. There's been some very weird stuff. Also stuff around the knowledge of how to throw and catch balls was being framed in the language of knowledge.
Yeah, count me out. I mean, I think any 4-year-old could teach me. You know, I'm just hopeless at that, because my PE teachers were all having a smoke and just left us to it. So yeah, but yeah, I think the other thing with early years is we have actual evidence that inspectors are going into schools I get a lot of people writing to me saying, the inspector came into early years, it's a secondary specialist. I've looked at their bio, they're secondary post-16 specialists. They've come into my early years setting and said, where's the curriculum plans for the 3- and 4-year-olds in history? And we said, well, we don't have that because we do the earlier statutory framework. No, you really should have these plans, and they're demanding plans that the school doesn't need to have. They're making quite bizarre suggestions by, you know, going up to 4-year-olds and saying, tell me about what you did in art last year. And I can't remember what they had for tea yesterday. And why do they need to know what they did in art last year? And this thing about children in the early years having this subject knowledge is a problem. And Ofsted's reaction when a group of the earlier specialists wrote to them was, basically, it's not happening. We don't believe that these inspectors are asking for this. They produced a myth-busting document.
Yeah.
Last week, I looked at a report for a 43-pupil school in, remote rural place. A 43-pupil school is probably going to have 2 classes. Would you agree, Frank? It's probably going to have EY Key Stage 1 and then Key Stage 2. So you've got a lot of mixed age group. work going on there. You start reading this report. Oh, it's a lovely school. The children are so happy. They come in, they enjoy everything.
I know where this is going.
Yeah, and it's a grade 3. Why is it a grade 3? Because the curriculum does not, including in the early years, does not contain specific subject knowledge. It's 43 children. It's probably 2 or 3 teachers. How can they be experts in all those subjects? This is nonsense. And it's in a report. How did that report get through QA? Why aren't Ofsted picking up that report and saying, blimey, we need to have a word with these inspectors? You know, meanwhile, that school's, you know, the thing on the estate agent's window, it's not a good school. And yet everything in it says, looks like a great school to me.
Yeah. So it seems to be that phrase that you used earlier that did you tweet it, Frank? This idea that if Ofsted had gone into schools post-COVID and they talked about what they were seeing rather than what they were wanting to see, and that seems to be a common theme, and it's something that came up in the first of these conversations that I had with Rebecca Leake. It's almost this idea that there's this game of like trying to guess what's in the inspector's head. And there's this idea that they're essentially trying to catch people out. Like if they're going up to kids and saying, what did you do in art last year? Or have you been taught about consent recently or whatever? Like, it's all very heightened, and it sort of seems to be coming from this fearful, anxious place. And it's like, right, they haven't met that standard, so we can mark them down. And it seems to be like whatever the opposite of strengths-based is. It's not like appreciative inquiry. It's like, it seems to be just like a deficit model, a series of landmines, a series of traps, a series of boxes that you can fall short of ticking, and therefore you're a bad school. It seems like that's been is that fair to say? Yeah. As people who've been on the inside of this, is that a shift that you've seen, a shift towards this more sort of catching people out mentality?
I think there was always I was involved in quite a few frameworks, so it was always sort of raising the bar. And there was always a slight, I mean, a good example is the emphasis placed on governance. It's sort of, in one framework, governors are critically important for the judgment on leadership. Suddenly the next framework, they're not, you know. And in a way, there's been that sort of fluctuating sort of position on some of these grades. But what this latest framework has done is it had this curriculum focus, and we had the crazy situation, which I don't think we've ever had before, where Ofsted were instructing schools on, in effect, you need your intent statement, you need your implementation. You know, all of these things were leading the profession in terms of what they needed to do to set their curriculum up, in effect, to get a successful Ofsted. Now, I don't recall anything quite like that happening. And you have to ask, why has that happened this time? And I think the reason why it's happened this time is because I think there is an ideological desire amongst some from within government and some supporters of government who have in effect infiltrated Ofsted, have seen the power of making this happen. And actually they have then created a framework which in a way felt at the time quite unbalanced, that it was emphasized. Obviously curriculum's important. The curriculum's been in every single framework since 1992, and it's been an important element. But what's happened is it's become top heavy in this inspection framework. So up to COVID, there was only a short window really before it, you know, when the framework was implemented, but actually the full impact of it hadn't been felt. Suddenly COVID came. So in this sort of unreal world, and now you know, I think people are realizing that we're starting to ask questions about, well, attendance is poor, isn't it? You know, we've got a problem with attendance. Funding's a bit of an issue, isn't it? Staff morale's a bit of an issue. Yeah, I'm not quite sure that actually, all of the support mechanisms, like for special educational needs, are in place. So these are sorts of things that you think, right, these are sort of issues you'd expect, I would be expecting inspectors to write about in their reports. James, you will struggle like hell to read them in any report. And Julie and I read, I think we read probably for 2 terms, we read virtually every single primary and secondary inspection report. And we were finding weaknesses in those reports because of this top heavy nature of the curriculum. And we reached out, didn't we, Julie? We saw some blatant mistakes in judgments that were made. We wrote to, I think, 15 or 20 of them, inviting them to come and talk to us about what the process was like. And just to reinforce what Julie was saying, I think only 2 of them were willing to do it.
Yeah.
So we have got now, and I think the reason why people didn't realize in Ofsted that they had a problem was very much around, well, if you've got an inspection business, you need some pretty experienced inspectors to help you do it. And what they've done is they've played the curriculum card, and the chief inspector has wanted to surround herself with curriculum experts, not inspectors, experts who probably never done inspection in their lives. And actually they're then advising the chief inspector. And when you look at the other senior managers, many of them were there when Julie and I were there. So they're not recent inspectors. They might lead an inspection business, but they don't do inspections like Julie and I did. And they don't have enough senior leaders from schools in there as well. So we've got this sort of like, it's not just one issue, it's a combination of all of these issues being played out. And this is why I feel as though whenever it hits the fan, the credibility of senior leaders in fronting it up is, and the reason why they go to Michael Wilshaw, he did inspect, he was ahead. You might not agree with everything he says, but at least those 2 bits of it he knows about. Get the senior leaders, I tell you now, get the senior leadership team from Ofsted and ask them, when were you last ahead? When did you last actually inspect? And you will find a massive gap emerging. And you think, well, you're going on Good Morning Britain? I don't think so. I think they're going to eat you alive. So we're best to just quieten down, there's a valid reason why they might not want to go public. But actually, if we take the terrible events that have happened recently, when I've seen chief inspectors and senior managers, they're not talking the language of leaders, current leaders, and they're not talking the language of inspection the way that I feel it is. It feels like it's a different process. It's just not, but actually, fundamentally, it's still the same. We're still inspecting schools, might have a different framework, but actually these are people that are, in my eyes, are not credible. They're not credible, either as a leader of a school or as a leader of an inspection team.
Interesting. So do you think, I was going to ask about what's happened, like how has this transition happened? But what you're describing is something that's really quite recent, that there's this recent, you said that there's recent infiltration of people with an ideological perspective, that they are, like emphasizing certain things coming from an ideological understanding of like the importance of curriculum. It's tied in with the knowledge-rich curriculum, and Ofsted sort of, making pronouncements about like defining learning as a change in long-term memory. They've got this very sort of neo-traditionalist conception of what learning is, of what education is. So you're talking about something that's happened really quite recently. Is that fair to say? Like this under Amanda Spielman's
I've never known. I delivered. I was leader of the framework team for the 2 inspections in 2012, the frameworks that came out then, and the last one was for Michael Wilshaw. Michael's view was always it was around leadership. He never pushed that curriculum model. He basically he understood, I think, and I think this is where it morphed in 2005, where we introduced shorter inspections, which were based on school self-evaluation, which is basically saying, do schools, go in, give a sense of, do the schools know themselves well enough to improve? That to do that, you've got to engage with leaders. We haven't got the answers. You've got the answers. What's the evaluation looking like? Have you got the right issues? Yes, you have. Okay, well, get on with it then. There will always be some failures in the system. There will always be what's called special measures schools. They require special measures to provide a satisfactory education. But actually, the vast majority of schools are not in that position. And like you were saying, James, the gap between some of the alleged weaker schools and some of your better schools, it's very thin. And it may be just 1 or 2 issues that are stopping the school from getting what might be the lauded great grade, you know, that they're after. But I feel as though we're in a bad position now because we haven't got sufficient expertise of inspection and of leadership, and the focus has moved to curriculum, not leadership. So I think we're in a sort of bad place, and I do feel as though it probably does need to be broken up. I think that the brand is in a really bad place.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it was quite recently. I sort of was more in the reformist camp, but I think that the brand has become so toxic in recent weeks that there needs to be some kind of a reset. So there's something else that's shifted recently, which was a very live issue in this recent case of Caversham Primary School in Reading, and the tragic circumstances around Ruth Perry's death, and that's safeguarding, which has become, it seems, much more of a focus in recent years than it has been previously, and it's become a sort of like a gatekeeper issue. So like, even if everything else is good or outstanding, if your safekeeping I beg your pardon, if your safeguarding is perceived to be weak, if your record keeping is perceived to be inadequate, then the whole grading is inadequate. That's something else that's happened quite recently. I wonder where that's come from. I don't know if you could speak to that, possibly, Julie.
I'm not sure where it's come from in terms of the most recent cases, and I certainly know of, and I contacted well before Caversham, actually, I contacted Frank about some schools inspected last summer who went to inadequate on the basis of safeguarding systems. We've been talking for a long time about how we think safeguarding in terms of compliance with, you know, the requirements is something that can come out of the inspection of the quality of education. It's something that can be looked at separately and should be looked at, in my view, should be looked at separately and should be looked at more frequently than schools are inspected. Because actually the requirements say you have to do this, and there's a lot of it. You're keeping children safe in education is quite, you know, a big document, but it's a fairly straightforward to go in and say, are you doing it? And actually, Frank will probably remember at one time, it was some years ago, Ofsted used to put a specialist safeguard inspector on a team for a day or half a day, and that's all they would do. So, you know, that sort of set a bit of a precedent there. I don't know. I mean, there are all sorts of theories knocking about. Again, it's to do with the high stakes thing about why this is happening. But I do know schools where they felt, going back to the deficit model thing you mentioned, James, about they were quizzing up staff, they were asking them questions, and they were looking to trip people up. So an example of that I can give you, and it's happened to my knowledge in 2 schools, is that they say to a teacher, what would you do if you suspected a case of FGM had actually happened in your school? Mm-hmm. Now, the correct answer, according to Keeping Children Safe in Education, is you phone the police. You go straight to the police. Okay, but in 2 cases, the teachers said, well, I tell the safeguarding lead and then I'd phone the police. Got you, you're wrong. You should go straight to the police. Now, they're going to go to the police, so it's a bit of a technicality. But again, oh yeah, you got that wrong. Goes to the safeguarding lead. Hey, your people don't know keeping children safe in education. It was very obviously coming over as a trick, as a trap. You know, in one case, the teacher was invited for feedback, got told they weren't having feedback. But can we take this opportunity to ask you about safeguarding? That was in one inspection that happened. And the other thing is, it's not as straightforward as it seems, because as far as the FGM thing is concerned, if you suspect it might be about to happen in the future, you must go to your DSL, and that it then becomes a social services matter, not the police. So it's not, it's a little bit more complex. If the police get to know within minutes, you're all right. But it's, to me, a ridiculous way of bringing schools into there. You're not doing this. It's not good enough. As a school, you're inadequate. And as we've seen, the head takes that you know, my leadership is in, because the safeguarding comes within the leadership and management judgment.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that to heart.
I think also there's the issue here that there was I'm just surmising now, so please take what I'm saying, you know, in that vein. But the new framework, there was a desire to sort of inspect those outstanding schools that had not been inspected for 10, 12 years. And also the framework doesn't really emphasize anymore the sort of the attainment, the progress measures in quite the same way. So it would have been easy, no, I'm not saying easy, but you could have focused a lot more on that element if that was still a significant part of the framework. And you would do that if you, for example, if you had a grammar school that, you know, that appeared to be doing quite well, but actually there were sort of like a block of kids in that school who were not making the progress that they could have. Now that data would have been quite useful to establish a sort of like a theory or a hypothesis, which you could ask your inspectors to go out and dig around in. Now, all of that sort of terrain within this framework had been lost. So in a way, this desire to sort of, well, we've got these schools, haven't inspected them for 12 years, you know, we've got far too many of these outstanding schools. We're going to, you know, actually, I don't mean this in that sense, but one part that you could say, well, you can't contest it, is something over safeguarding. Yeah. You know, so in effect, it's, yeah, you know, it's a done deal. You know, that's what we found. I'm really sorry. The framework tells us we've got to do this. Now, I'm not saying now that safeguarding is very, very important. And the point that Julie made is so important that we shouldn't be leaving it for 12 years to decide whether or not there are safeguarding concerns in the school. So in a way, I think the problems that it's created in the unfairness, I think, in terms of the way, again, you know, you create a framework which is far too top heavy. You know, it's got a couple of these sort of golden tickets. If you don't get the golden tickets, folks, you're down, you know. And actually previously it was much more of a rounded judgment, you know, and I think we Julie and I know of one framework where it was basically perm 5 from 7 judgments. If you get 5 of them as good, then you're fine. Do you remember that one, Julie? But actually, I think that one. But you remember that?
I remember it well, but that was the Every Child Matters. It was built around Every Child Matters.
And I think the thing is that this is that created this sort of problem now, in terms of, you know, Ofsted wanting to reduce the number of outstanding schools, justifying why it should spend more money on these schools that have previously been left alone. You know, I think that in a way, somebody should have seen that that was a potential problem. And actually, I think if Julie and I had constructed the framework, I'm not saying we would have found everything would have been fine, but I think we would have thought, actually, we could get some pretty unstable judgments emerging here because we haven't got the data, we haven't got the progress data, we're not really getting into all of these classrooms because they're doing these deep dives as well, which again can destabilize. You know, James, you might have 5 fantastic departments and 5 that aren't so very good. We roll up and we say we're going to look at the 5 really poor. Yeah, it's just chance that we've got a design technology colleague on our team. He's desperate to do the deep dive, and you get, it's unfortunately didn't do history because we're really good. But all of that played into it as well. You know, so I think that there is, you know, this whole thing around safeguarding and the grade 1s has been. It would have been fairly predictable, I think, for seasoned inspectors to identify that potential problem emerging.
Right. Yeah, I can see that, and it does it. I mean, it doesn't take a moment's consideration, does it, to see? I've got the Caversham page on the Ofsted site here. The recent inspection, November 22, inadequate. Previous inspection was in 2009, like 13 years previously. Like, how can you think for a moment that it's okay to be, you know, the regulator who sort of goes around and you know, decides whether schools are safe or not once every 13 years, and to think that you're doing your job in keeping those children safe? Like, it's just such a ridiculous system.
I think also one of the things, there's a bit of a I've never said this before, so this is a first. An exclusive. But actually, every year Ofsted would have done a risk assessment on all of the schools, right? So they could easily have chosen to have inspected many more of those grade 1 schools. Julie and I could create a criteria that would easily have swept up a lot of those.
Yep.
So in a way, you know, and it says in the report, you know, this is a new framework and whatever, and I do know in the past they've said, you know, it's you know, it was the was it a government decision or whatever? There was a decision not to inspect these schools, but actually they don't reference the fact that, well, we risk assess them all every year and decided not to inspect them. You know,
sorry, how do they do that risk? So currently, Ofsted risk assess every school in the country every year.
They did do before.
They did.
Yeah, they did do.
How
And
can
of
they
course,
do that without inspecting them?
Well, you could look at attendance figures. You could look. It could be a trigger.
I see.
Three new heads in the last 3 years.
Right.
That's quite interesting, isn't it? Or it could be a persistent absence. It could be a drop in performance. It could be, you know, the data can take you down nationally to how well are kids on free school meals doing? How well are those that perform really badly at Key Stage 2? How well are they performing in the school? You can really slice it right down. And if you're looking at sort of, as a colleague of ours, Adrian, will tell you, you know, the grammar schools, you know, there is quite a lot of underachievement in some of those grammar schools. It would have been very easy to unpick some of the data to identify schools that probably needed a visit. Now, who knows? I don't know whether the school that we're referencing there would have been triggered by that. But actually, I think that, you know, this idea that Ofsted have said, well, we had permission, in effect, not to inspect these outstanding schools, ignores the fact that they did risk assessments on them. And,
Right.
and when you expect, the government would expect, I would expect that Parliament expects Ofsted to have an oversight over schools. Even if they're not inspecting them, they have to report annually, I think, still, you know, within the annual report. And actually, I think this is where, you know, the whole thing has become a little bit murky as to, you know, what its role is. Is it about actually a curriculum development? Because there are these sort of curriculum guides and things, you know, which have been produced recently. It's been many years since we've had those. But actually, a lot of that evidence is not inspection evidence, you know. And what Ofsted should be doing is just report, Chief Inspector, just report on what your inspectors have seen.
Yeah, they've got this like research department now, haven't they? They're publishing these research summaries and things. Yeah, that's my sort of instinct, is that it's sort of the remit has become so swollen that it's looking at all of this stuff, which is all sort of quite intellectually interesting. You can see why they would want to be, you know, doing this interesting research-based
But that's
stuff.
your job, James. You're a researcher.
Exactly.
You know,
Get your hands
it's
up.
not Ofsted's job to be doing.
Well, I agree. I don't think it is their job, and I think that their remit has become so bloated that they're not able to essentially do their basic function, which is to make sure that these schools are keeping kids safe, which seems to be surely it should be slimmed right down. Well, I don't know. I say surely. That's my current take on it. So I need to wrap this up in about 15 minutes or so, because I've got another call coming on. So the chief inspector's job is up at the moment. So I'm assuming that you've put in your application for a job share, Frank and Julie. What's going to be in your first 100 days of office? Like, what would you do to fix this current situation that we find ourselves in?
I think it needs, as you say, it needs a rebrand. It needs a sort of chassis up restoration. You know, if it was a car, you would be looking at taking it right down and then building it up again. Listening to the many ideas that are coming forward. And I personally, I would not be afraid to go pretty radical. As I say, I would like safeguarding to be looked at separately as a compliance thing, and I'd like it done reasonably frequently. As far as the actual quality of education is concerned, I think we've got to go back to a more rounded view. But one of the reasons that inspectors, you know, head teachers like to go and inspect is because they get to see other schools, and head teachers love to see each other's schools. And there's a lot of this stuff coming forward about, you know, peer review and the role of peer review. I wouldn't like to put anything more solid on it than that at the moment, but I think there's a role for that. I think there's a role of the inspector to sort of be the chair of all that, if you think, and be the moderator of all that and keep that, you know, in the direction we want it to go. Do we need grades? That's up for discussion. Do we need an overall effectiveness grade? I think possibly not. And it's interesting that in some of the previous frameworks, we've had overall effectiveness and capacity to improve, if you remember, which is a big one. I still think if you go to any organization, any successful organization anywhere in the world, whether it's, you know, an education establishment or a big business, they will always say, you cannot do the job unless you know yourself well. And this self-evaluation thing has never gone away. I think the ability to look, with assistance from others if necessary, to look at what's going on and have an objective view. This is what we do really well. This is what we really need to improve urgently. I think that's got to go back to being at the basis of everything.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm really pleased that Julie supports the self-evaluation approach, because, you know, I've been a big fan of that. But I think that also, I think if Julie and I were in charge, I'd certainly disband that curriculum unit. I'd refresh the senior leadership team. I'd also demand that the board en masse resign, and we appoint a new board. You know, because at the end of the day, these things don't happen, you know, in businesses and organizations that are governed well. And I think that there are sort of things here which are sort of saying to me that there's a bit of an ethical collapse occurring in the organization somewhere. I'm not in on it anymore in quite the same way. But I think also I would also like the idea of this peer review being part of the evidence that a school would draw on in terms of saying how effective it was, and also say that I'd really welcome, I think I would have an expectation that every school in the community would help other schools in their community, you know, so that it wasn't so much a sort of, in effect, we're looking at a good overall education service as opposed to one that highlights, on a framework, those that are doing really well and those that aren't doing quite so well. You know, we've got in this situation where we do need to make it more equitable and more supportive of each other. So I think that we should really be quite critical of schools that don't support others in their community, you know, as if to say, well, I'm quite happy that school down the road is not very good because actually we get all their good kids. You know, there's a bit of that thinking going on, and actually the education service, the country requires effective schools, you know, not some, there will be some that are probably better than others, but we need to be trying to level that out a little bit more, because I think we'll make more progress as a country and young people get a better deal if actually we could assure that they're all going to, I'm not going to say good schools, but pretty decent schools, you know.
Yeah, completely. And that's something else that you sort of talked about earlier, or you almost touched upon earlier, about the way in which Ofsted grades like often reflect prior attainment and socioeconomic status of the local community. I remember seeing a graph a while ago, and it was like prior attainment on the x-axis, like GCSE attainment. So this was secondary school GCSE attainment of this axis, and it was almost like, so it was like average SAT scores and average GCSE scores, and it was almost a perfect positive correlation. And then they color coded them according to their Ofsted judgment, and all the green ones, all the Ofsted outstanding ones, were all the ones in these lovely leafy suburbs with, you know, high prior attainment and middle class intakes. It's like, so there's something about the methodology of that just seems to be deeply unfair. Like if you could, I've often thought of this as like, if you could imagine it as like a Channel 4 show where you like blindfold a team of like 4 inspectors and you just helicopter them into the playground of a school. They don't have any prior attainment data, nothing. They just got to go around and look at what's happening in that school and see if they can match what the most recent Ofsted thing was. And I would hazard a guess that they would get it the same no more often than chance, because like you say, there's so much sort of baggage that comes with it. So there's something about the methodology of these reports that the inspections that we need to somehow, I don't know, it's hard, that, isn't it? Like, because obviously we can't do that. We can't just helicopter blindfolded inspectors into schools. Do you have any thoughts on how we could make the actual process of an inspection fairer? Like, we've gone from, like you were saying, from week-long inspections led by subject experts to, often, what is it, a day and a half an inspection on very short notice with people who are often operating outside of their area of expertise. How would you tighten up the actual processes of inspections themselves?
I would say that, and it links with what we've been saying about the COVID thing, that we've got to shift from schools are using this as an excuse to this is genuinely the school's context. And it's this idea about, I was saying about COVID, it's not an excuse, it's a reason. Yes, we've got so much more in terms of mental health problems for these children. Yeah, COVID's not an excuse for that. It is an absolute reason for that, whatever the complexities were, what those children went through. So inspectors have got to stop looking at curriculum documents and putting 90% of the value on that. Actually look at the school community and what's been done for them. And it's difficult. I know school leaders that do make things sound like they're excuses, and Ofsted are, no excuses. And I get that, but actually the reality is pretty bad for some families, for some children. I don't think inspectors always know that. I think there's a lot of complexities also tied up with the competing multi-academy trust systems that's going on at the moment. We've got to get rid of that. But actually, the more flexible we make it, the better it's going to be. Because at the moment, Ofsted are getting things wrong. They're getting grades wrong. And until we take away the idea, because if they're getting some of it wrong, how do we know which ones they're getting right? How do we know which ones the estate agents are saying are the right ones? So yeah. I think it's about, we used to have a progress measure called contextual value added.
Yeah.
And, all these progress measures have been, swings and roundabouts, but contextual value added, you could get a school in like the worst part of the, most deprived part of the country. And if they had a high CVA, then you knew they were doing, good things for the children. So this wasn't perfect, but I think it's better than what we've got now.
Yeah. I tweeted about this today, James. I mean, I was reminded of it that because I do work for the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, we have engaged with what's now Professor George Leckie at the University of Bristol, who started to look at the Progress 8 measure that was being used by the government, or the DfE, Ofsted, to determine how much progress was being made by students. And then he just put other factors in, like the number of children with special educational needs, number of children with EAL, the number of children who perhaps had only been at the school for 2 or 3 years. All of these factors go into an algorithm. And we produced, Northern Powers Partnership produced, I think 2 years running, a fairer league table. And there is one school that is now closed in Cheshire that was top, or very close to the top. No, it's the most improved school. That was it. It rose. There were 3,300 and something secondary schools. And this school had the greatest rise in performance, from right down at the bottom using the government's measure into the fairer league table. And actually that school no longer exists because it was closed because of the poor previous performance. And all it is an algorithm. And it's a very, very crude algorithm. And actually what we, in a way, if I think a focus should be much more on those kids that we know have a fair chance of not getting a good deal. So those are kids who are probably long-term disadvantaged, that they're being, the parents are on benefit having to claim free school meals for them, special educational needs, Gypsy Roma families. You start getting a focus on those, the ones where actually, these are the ones that we know the system is telling us. These are the ones that often the system fails these children. If a focus of inspection was, well, how well are they doing? How well are they doing? And I tell you now, because of the fact that many of these children exist in some of our most deprived communities, those schools are on it. Because if they're not on it, they'll lose the school. And it's the ones then that starts to draw out those that are sort of perhaps in the more affluent areas that don't have quite those numbers, where actually I think we'd start to find some real weaknesses in provision And that actually could start to balance up the process, you know, because I think we'll find that some of our very best practice is in some of the most challenging communities, and some of our worst practice, basically there's no practice, you know, you're in the flow of it, there's no extra provision for you. That's where actually I think we'll find some real weaknesses. So I think that it's just, what do you want to put in that algorithm, you know, and in a way a framework, Ofsted framework, is an algorithm at the end of the day. You know, Amanda Spillman, I think, wrongly has put too much weight on the curriculum, probably, you know, unbalanced the safeguarding judgment, but that's all an algorithm at the end of the day. Michael Wilshaw would have said, for me, it's all about leadership. Get good leadership. We've probably got some chances for some future improvement. We're probably on a stronger wicket, you know. I think it's just where we go with it. But I think that we should focus much more on what we know. Years and years and years of evidence is telling us and in a way the country needs for its economic future as much as anything else, as well as the individual needs, but it needs to enable these young people to get the best chance they can to actually contribute to society going forward.
Yeah, completely. Well, thank you for that. That's been really, really insightful. I feel like we could indeed chat about this all day. There's so much more to talk about, but we are going to have to wrap it up, or else
Can I just say, James, when Julie and I are the first co-chief inspectors in the future, because I think what's going to happen, they're going to look at all the applications and they're going to say, you know, I think Frank and Julie could probably do a better job. So when we get that post, we're going to bring you on and we're going to do an exclusive with the 2 new chief inspectors.
Done deal. I can be your tea boy. That sounds good for me. And if I can get Friday afternoons off, that'd be perfect.
We'll meet you in the pub on Friday lunchtime.
Bring back lunchtime drinking. That's what we need to do.
Well, can I just say, all the schools in the Highlands do finish at lunchtime on a Friday. So thanks for that. Yeah.
So much enlightenment north of the border, honestly, and west of the border. Some exciting stuff happening. We didn't get a chance to look at that. What they've done with Eston in Wales and in Northern Ireland recently. Changes to the inspectorate. The answers are in the room, as it were. You know, yes. Hopefully we'll see some movement on this soon, because it can't continue, can it? It's not good. Well, thank you both. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'll be in touch soon.